First of all, allow me to express my gratitude for the fact that you are investing time and such considerable efforts to take part in the 7th Academic Society for Competition Law Conference at Mackenzie Presbyterian University Law School. Over these 2 days, we will together, academics and authorities from different countries and cultures, discuss competition law, specifically state-initiated restraints of competition. This is a very important issue to all the countries, particularly in a time of global financial crisis, when the role of the state in economies is the subject of huge debate. The setting for our debate is the historical university founded in 1870 by 2 Presbyterian missionaries from the United States who introduced a revolutionary pedagogical philosophy for that time. For the first time in Brazilian history, both men and women of different races and religions were accepted to study together. In 1896, Mackenzie initiated its first undergraduate course, engineering, in partnership with the State University of New York. The law school was established on the 11th of August 1953, the same date celebrated by the law community as the anniversary of the founding of Brazil's first law school in 1827. Today, Mackenzie Law School is one of the most traditional in Brazil and is ranked as one of the elite. Since 2001, when competition law studying group was created, competition law has become an important issue at Mackenzie. Holding the Ascola conference is a landmark achievement for the competition law studying group. This is possible because of our friends from Ascola, a special thanks to Josef Drexl, and the heads at Mackenzie, a special thanks to Benedito Guimarães Aguiar Neto, rector of Mackenzie, Ezio César de Souza Maciel, president of Mackenzie Presbyterian Institute, Núncio Teófilo Neto, director of the law school, José Francisco Siqueira Neto, coordinator of law postgraduate studies, and Wallace Teske Sabaini, director of the Mackenzie Presbyterian Institute, who all recognize the potential of this conference, a unique opportunity to bring together academics from different nations and universities. I hope that you have a great time debating competition law, making new friends, and also take the opportunity to get to know a bit of this very cosmopolitan city that is São Paulo. Now, I would like to invite Gilberto Bercovici from Mackenzie and University of São Paulo, Thomas Cheng from University of Hong Kong, and Josef Drexl from Max Planck Institute to begin their talks so we can start the first part of the conference, entitled State-Owned Enterprise. And I also invited Olavo Chinaglia, president of CADE, the Brazilian Competition Authority, and José Maria Arruda Andrade from São Paulo University, who will be our commentators.
I'd like to thank Ascola and Mackenzie Presbyterian University for this opportunity for me to come and visit Brazil for the first time. I'm from the University of Hong Kong, so I flew about 25 hours yesterday to get here. If I don't seem to be making much sense, I blame it on the flight. And I was also quite pleasantly surprised to hear that the 2 American missionaries introduced coeducational university education here much sooner than it seems like some American universities did back home. It was quite interesting to me. But I am going to talk about the regulation of state-owned enterprises in mainland China, very far from Brazil. Also, a jurisdiction where this problem is probably particularly pertinent. And I'm going to take a slightly broader perspective and focus more than just conventional competition regulation, because in all honesty, the problem or the issue of state-owned enterprises in China goes much beyond competition regulation. And as a lot of you may be familiar, China used to be a centrally planned economy, and it has moved very far from that, and it is now in some sense one of the most market-oriented and competitive economies in the world, but parts of the Chinese economy remain very much state-controlled. And the connection between state-owned enterprises and the party state, the government, enormously complicates the issue of regulation of state-owned enterprises in China. And that is why I would like to start off by painting a broad picture of the situation in China and to impress upon you that the problem really goes much further beyond just simple competition regulation. The way the Chinese government, the Chinese party state, and I use the term party state as distinct from the government because, again, as a lot of you may know, the Chinese Communist Party is very much integrated with the government. In fact, is sometimes somewhat arbitrary to distinguish the two because the two are in many instances just one. And they control a great part of the Chinese economy, at least in certain sectors. And the SOEs, the issue of the SOEs in many ways are a reflection of the party's economic policy. So, state-owned enterprises in China, the issue of state-owned enterprises in China really reflects, manifest themselves in many different political economic dimensions. As is true in a lot of developing countries, state-owned enterprises are used as a tool of national economic development. During the centrally planned economy period, state-owned enterprises were the economy, were national economic development. That has obviously changed a lot. There is now a lot of private enterprises, but that doesn't change from the fact that in some sectors in the economy, and I will name them shortly, which are still very much dominated by the state sector, and the Chinese government still sees state-owned enterprises as a key engine in national economic growth. State-owned enterprises also reflect the role of the Chinese Communist Party in the economy. I think it is fair to say that the CCP likes to maintain control over the economy by way of these state-owned enterprises. Just to illustrate the inextricable link between state-owned enterprises and the party and the government in China, the CEOs of major state-owned enterprises in China are actually vice minister rank in the government. Upon departure from state-owned enterprises, they could and they do go back and join the government as vice ministers or even higher. That also presents some serious problems for regulation because sometimes the CEO of the state-owned enterprise ranks higher in the official hierarchy than the competition regulator, and it creates a lot of awkward problems for competition regulation. State-owned enterprises also touches on central-local fiscal relationship. It may be a common conception from outside China that China is a unitary state run by a very powerful, if not authoritarian government. But the fact is, and it has always been true in China's history, that China is actually a grossly decentralized state in many ways. Local governments and provincial governments remain powerful. And one particular dimension to the state-owned enterprise, one particular dimension to central-local relationship that impacts on state-owned enterprises is the fact that the Chinese fiscal system, the way taxation is levied, collected, and distributed, has some kinks in it, which creates huge incentives for local governments to groom their own state-owned enterprises to raise revenue. To put it very plainly, the central government does not always give provincial and local governments enough money for their own obligations. County governments in China are responsible for more than 50% of government welfare outlays, but their share of tax revenue falls much shorter than that. And what do? They don't have enough money. The central government doesn't give them enough money, and so they run their own enterprises. They make money from the people to use as for their own expenses. And that also creates an enormous problem for competition regulation of state-owned enterprises. And the last two dimensions, just quickly. I think there's no question that China uses state-owned enterprises as a tool of industrial policy. So I think it is impossible to talk about regulation of state-owned enterprises in China without also touching on industrial policy and to what extent it has worked in China and not worked in China, and at what point should the Chinese government ease up on industrial policy. State-owned enterprises manifest themselves in a number of legal dimensions. Corporate governance is a very serious problem. Most major state-owned enterprise, a number of major state-owned enterprises, and you may be surprised to know these are some of the largest companies in the world, some of them are actually Fortune 500 companies, don't have a board. And it's something that is continuously being worked on, but it remains true that the state of corporate governance of state-owned enterprises in China is highly unsatisfactory. It also manifests itself in bankruptcy and insolvency law because problematic state-owned enterprises, loss-making state-owned enterprises need to be pushed out of the market. They need to go bankrupt. And bankruptcy is another area where we see state-owned enterprises. We should see state-owned enterprises feature prominently, but we don't. And that is another problem with state-owned enterprises in China. The government is not willing to see them go. And they try to save them by pushing them into profitable enterprises or packaging them into something else. Of course, competition law, and this is what my presentation is ultimately about, and I will discuss a few cases of where competition law is at work against state-owned enterprises. And lastly, there are specific government legislation applicable to state-owned enterprises only, and the most recent one is the State-Owned Enterprises Law of 2008. It delineates the relationship, or it attempts to anyway, between the government and state-owned enterprises. So just a brief history, and I like to keep it very brief because I have a tendency to speak too much, of the history of state-owned enterprise reform in China. And the reform of state-owned enterprises in China is, of course, inextricably linked to the general opening of the economy. I'm not going to bore you with all the impressive statistics that are often cited to illustrate how far the Chinese economy has come along since 1979. But it wasn't always this rosy. State-owned enterprises in China now are regarded as doing well. They are profit-making, at least, and they're very strong. They are very large. 60% of the largest businesses in China are now state-owned enterprises. And they dominate some crucial sectors. But it wasn't always this rosy. When the economy was first opened, what the Chinese government realized was that a lot of the state-owned enterprises were completely defunct. They were loss-making. They were not run like real businesses. And they were there to provide welfare to the people, because at the time, if you belong to a state-owned enterprise, your education is provided by the enterprise, your health care is provided by the enterprise, your pension is provided by the enterprise, and you are a man of the state-owned enterprise for your life. And so state-owned enterprises performed a role that goes much beyond merely profit-making, but they were not sustainable. And so when the economy first opened, a great concern of the government was to try to reform the enterprises, to restructure them, to salvage whatever the government could from the state-owned enterprises and let the loss-making ones go. And a lot of state-owned enterprises did close down during the 80s and 90s. And the ones that could be salvaged were combined into larger enterprises. So this effort was quite successful. By the time we hit the 1990s, the focus of state-owned enterprise reform began to change. The Chinese government began more focused on consolidating state-owned enterprises to create national champions. And from the 1990s on, the focus was on creating scale. And I think it's probably fair to say that the Chinese government has succeeded in this respect. But at the same time, there is recognition that the government should open more and more of the economy to the private sector. So under the 12th five-year plan, which is currently underway, the government has pledged to reduce the share of SOEs in national industrial output from 27% to around 10% in 2030. So while consolidating state-owned enterprises to create national champions, the recognition is still that state-owned enterprises should shrink. And the plan is to shrink their output their share in national industrial output further in the next 18 years or so. So just some basic facts about SOEs in China to give you a sense of what they are and what they do and their significance in the Chinese economy. So by and large, since the late 1990s to recent times, the state-owned enterprises have been receding. Their importance in the national economy has been receding. But there is some countervailing concerns about state-owned enterprises. On the one hand, if you look at the statistics, it seems to suggest that they are becoming less and less important. But on the other hand, the public's general sentiment is that the state-owned enterprises, the government, is exerting more control over the economy. In Chinese, there is a phrase called 国进民退, and it literally means the state expands, the private sector recedes, and that is on the lips of a lot of Chinese these days. The anecdotal evidence and common perception is that the state is once again expanding its reach in the national economy. But if you look at the statistics, that doesn't seem to be the case. You can see that percentage of total industrial enterprises dropped from almost 40% in 1998 to only 4.5% in 2010. And this is number, which is slightly deceptive because, as I said, the state-owned enterprises are becoming fewer in number but much, much larger. So if you look at the rest of the statistics, you can see state-owned enterprises accounted for about 70% of total industrial assets in 1998, but about 42.4% in 2010. So you can see about 4.5% of the number of industrial enterprises in the country are state-owned, and they own about 42.4% of the national industrial assets. So one characteristic of state-owned enterprises in China is that they're generally very capital intensive. They tend to cluster around heavy industries. You can also see, well, even as recent as 1998, state-owned enterprises accounted for about 60% of total employment of the country. That has dropped to about 20%. And total exports have dropped from 57% to about 15%. A large part of Chinese exports is produced by private enterprises. That is true in Guangdong and near Shanghai. State-owned enterprises tend to be focused on more industries and sectors that are more national in scope. So state-owned enterprises, I've said that they are very large in scale, and this just gives you a sense. In 2010, the top 10 industrial state-owned enterprises accounted for more than 80% of the total industrial SOE production. So we're so the rest of the state-owned enterprises only contribute less than 20% of the total industrial SOE production by Chinese state-owned enterprises. So state-owned enterprises in China are enormous. Despite all that, the World Bank has assessed the state of industrial concentration in China and found that perhaps somewhat surprisingly, industrial concentration in most sectors in China is very low, lower than most OECD countries, and in fact even lower than the US. In fact, I believe only less than 25% of the sectors in China have an HHI of 4 digits. So we're talking about, this probably is largely a function of the size of the country, of the economy, that despite these giant state-owned enterprises, most industries in China are fairly unconcentrated. So from that perspective, you may think that there isn't much, we have less concern from a competition law perspective against state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises are reformed. They are much more productive than they used to be, but studies have shown that they are still less productive, conclusively so, than private sectors. And so the basic picture we have is state-owned enterprises in China now tend to be large industrial enterprises, capital intensive, and still not the most productive and profitable. And in fact, some commentators have argued that the profitability of Chinese state-owned enterprises is overstated because Chinese state-owned enterprises are more likely to be found in natural monopoly sectors. And so they earn a monopoly rent from their natural monopoly positions. For example, telecom, electricity generation and distribution, airlines. These are some of the sectors dominated by the state sector. And their profitability is probably artificially boosted by the monopoly positions in these sectors. And also, Chinese state-owned enterprises enjoy privileged access to credit. 70–80% of the banking sector, actually, if not higher, in the banking sector in China is run by state-owned enterprises. And to give you a very common complaint among private entrepreneurs in China is that they can't get bank loans. The bank loans go to state-owned enterprises. And just to, as an illustration, in the middle of the financial crisis, the Chinese government put forward a fiscal stimulus package of 586 billion US dollars. It's reported that more than 70% of that money went to state-owned enterprises. And the private sector did not benefit much from it. And further anecdotal evidence is that some of that fiscal stimulus went into the pockets of officials and executives who came to Hong Kong to buy property, which makes property a lot more expensive for us people in Hong Kong. We're not very happy about that, but so the Chinese government, the State Council, which is the Chinese government's cabinet, distinguishes state-owned enterprises into 3 categories: industrial SOEs, financial SOEs, and non-financial service SOEs. The PowerPoint gives you an idea of where state-owned enterprises are usually found. Industrial SOEs, energy, petrol, chemicals, heavy machinery. Financial SOEs, these are mostly banks and insurance companies, and a vast majority of banks in China are state-owned. They may be owned by the central governments or local governments, but they are state-owned. There is a recent attempt to introduce reform in the financial sector. The State Council has recently designated a city in eastern China called Wenzhou, where private banks are allowed to be established. And very typical fashion in Chinese reform, allow it to happen in one city, one area, or some local areas, see how it goes. If it goes well, introduce it to the rest of the economy. And SAC, the State Assets Supervision Administration Commission. I need to introduce that because it is the Chinese government's agency that owns and controls a large part of the state-owned enterprises. And the SASEC has been described as the largest controlling shareholder in the world. And it controls and owns more than 50% of the industrial state-owned enterprises owned by the central government. So the SASAC has, in 2007, declared that 7 strategic sectors must remain under absolute control of the government: defense, electricity generation and distribution, petroleum and petrochemicals, telecom, coal, civil aviation, and waterway transport. These are industries which the Chinese government has identified as key to the national economy and also to national security, and the Chinese government is unwilling to relinquish control over them in the near future. There are a number of industries which have been designated as basic or pillar, and these are industries where state-owned enterprises will maintain a strong presence but will not control, will not establish and maintain absolute control: machinery, automobiles, information technology, construction, base metals, and chemicals. So, industrial policy in China. As I said, state-owned enterprises and their functioning, their role in the Chinese economy is inseparable from industrial policy in China. The World Bank, in its report on the Chinese economy, released, I think it was about 2 months ago, when it was released, commented on industrial policy in China, and identified a number of defining characteristics of industrial policy in the country. And by and large, the World Bank report acknowledged that industrial policy has worked in China, but there are failures as well. One notable example is the automobile sector. The Chinese government has declared an intention to groom national champions in the automobile sector as early as the 1990s, and it still hasn't worked. China still doesn't see a world-leading, or at least a global automobile company, despite the amount of money pumped into the automobile sector. But it has worked in some other instances. The 3 Chinese national petrochemical SOEs are now some of the largest in the world. And among the 7 defining characteristics, I would just make a brief mention of the last 2. And that also touches on one problem with controlling state-owned enterprises in China, which is that there are a lot of people involved. Despite the control the party state maintains over the economy, a lot of people are involved in controlling and running state-owned enterprises and implementing industrial policy in China. The central government owns about 120 state-owned enterprises, but provincial and local governments own a lot more of them. They all have their state-owned enterprises. They all implement their own version of industrial policy. So there are often conflicting policies involved, and that remains one of the biggest problems for regulation of state-owned enterprises, and also the application of competition regulation to state-owned enterprises in China. So the current legal framework, how does the Chinese government attempt to use the law to control and administer and regulate state-owned enterprises in China? There have been attempts to use an increasing reliance on government regulation to control state-owned enterprises in China, and also not just to control state-owned enterprises, but to regulate the economy in China. But the fact remains that many parts of the Chinese government still prefer to use direct administrative control. If there is a problem with a particular state-owned enterprise, as opposed to legislating and applying the law to regulate it, to bring an action in the court, the Chinese government's preferred mode of operation is still to use administrative control to just tell the CEO, stop doing this. Which is why one of the cases I'm going to talk about shortly is particularly interesting, because the competition regulator actually brought action against two of the largest state-owned enterprises in China. And a lot of the commentators in China were completely taken by surprise, but I'll speak more about that. So the current regulatory framework, as I said, SAC is the Chinese government ministry. It is a ministry-level government body that controls state-owned enterprises. And it's very large, as I said. But apart from SAC, which functions both as the owner and the regulator of state-owned enterprises in China, which itself also creates a problem, because there's often a confusion of roles by SAC and in interfacing with the state-owned enterprises. It's both the owner, but it also regulates the state-owned enterprises. It also is supposed to receive dividends from state-owned enterprises. And the problem is that, and that has some implication for competition regulation, is that a lot of the major state-owned enterprises in China have not actually been paying dividends to the Chinese government. And what that means is that they accumulate a lot of cash, and they have a soft budget constraints, which leads them to be inefficient, but which also gives them quite a lot of leeway to engage in anti-competitive practices, such as predatory pricing. So in addition to SASAC, a number of government bodies are involved in regulating state-owned enterprises. And as I said earlier, there are many multi-actor action involved in the interface between the government and state-owned enterprises. Some sectoral regulators, for example. It's worth pointing out that a lot of these sectoral regulators were not regulators to begin with. These were government ministries that owned these state-owned enterprises during China's central planning economy days. The Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, MMIT, for example, used to be the ministry that owned and ran these telecom companies. So the relationship between MMIT and the enterprises that it regulates goes much further beyond a regulator and regulated enterprises. The Civil Aviation Administration, of course, runs the airlines. And again, it owns the airlines, it regulates the airlines, and again, it is also the ministry that used to be the central planning authority over the airlines during China's central planning economy days. And finally, of course, there are competition agencies. There are 3 of them, and some of you may be familiar and some of you maybe not, so I'll just say briefly about what they do. There are 3 competition agencies in China, and I believe Brazil is the same, right? I think. And the 3 ministries have different functions. Ministry of Commerce is in charge of merger review. State Administration of Industry and Commerce is in charge of enforcing against non-price related anti-competitive conduct. And the National Development and Reform Commission is in charge of enforcing against price-related anti-competitive conduct. And for those of you in the audience who wonder, how do you draw the line between price-related and non-price-related anti-competitive conduct? And at the end of the day, isn't most non-price anti-competitive conduct done to affect the price? It was a very formalistic distinction drawn by the government when the law was made, and it was not based on any competition law principles that this was done. It was done because National Development and Reform Commission used to be the central planning authority in charge of price regulation. So when the anti-monopoly law was legislated, it was decided that it makes most sense for it to continue to regulate anything to do with price. But I think the authorities are beginning to discover that the distinction doesn't actually work. But so you have multiple actors involved. You have the competition agencies that are supposedly enforcing competition law against the state-owned enterprises. You have the sectoral regulators and the SASAC, which both own and regulate the state-owned enterprises. And so enough of background introduction. What are the competition problems we see presented by state-owned enterprises in China? So a number of different dimensions, a number of different problems, and they go beyond traditional anti-competitive conduct that is regulated by competition law. And the reason, as I said, is, as I said in the beginning of my presentation, the very close and complex relationship between state-owned enterprises and the government in China. First, you have the traditional anti-competitive conduct that is perpetrated by state-owned enterprises. You have predatory pricing. These are just some examples, obviously. These are not, the list is not exclusive. Margin squeeze, which has been reportedly engaged by two leading telecom operators in China, refusal to deal, and anti-competitive mergers. For example, two major airline companies merged in 2009. The Civil Aviation Administration of China basically told two airline companies, state-owned enterprises, to merge because it was decided that it would be better for those two companies. The merger was not notified to the antitrust authorities, to the competition regulators. And this remains one serious problem with competition regulation in China, which is that the sectoral regulators, which still see their enterprises as their domain, refuse to yield control, refuse to subject their enterprises to the competition regulators. So in 2009, two major airlines, and it's widely believed that the merger did present competition problems, merged, announced nationally, but no filing was made to the Ministry of Commerce, even though it was clear that it was required by the law. And the Ministry of Commerce couldn't do anything about it. So anti-competitive conduct, state subsidy and state aid issues. This is a serious problem, and there is currently no regulation of state aid in any laws in China. The anti-monopoly law, which was passed in 2008, regulates traditional anti-competitive conduct and abuse of administrative monopoly, to which I'll turn shortly. But there is no regulation of state aid, and a lot of commentators argue that this is probably the most serious problem because state-owned enterprises, in fact, enjoy very privileged access to capital. As I said, state-owned banks tend to lend money much more easily to state-owned enterprises. I mentioned the fiscal stimulus package, 70% of which went to state-owned enterprises. And other forms of assistance. State aid is not just confined to easier, cheaper bank loans. Government authorities extend various forms of assistance to state-owned enterprises, easier customs clearance, for example. Without the introduction of state aid rules, a lot of people argue that there will never be a true level playing field between state-owned enterprises and private companies in China. And lastly, abuse of administrative monopoly. This is a term, I guess, coined in China to describe what, I guess, for those of you in the audience who are European lawyers would generally refer to as free movement of goods issues. And also, there is some freedom of establishment issues too covered by abuse of administrative monopoly. But here we are talking about government, which I believe we will look at shortly in the presentation in this afternoon. Government action that interferes with the market. The most extreme example we've noted in China is a local government's outright blockade of non-local goods. A local enterprise produces cement. The local government wants all local private enterprises to use locally produced cement. What it does to achieve that result, it just erects roadblocks to stop non-local cement from entering the locality. It used to be quite common in the late 90s and early 2000s. I think there are fewer and fewer reports of that since, but that is the extent of the problem. Local governments used no finesse about their interference in the markets. They just imposed an outright blockade. But there are other forms of abuses too. More onerous administrative clearance procedures for non-local enterprises, discriminatory inspection requirements and technology standard requirements and all that. For those of you who are EU lawyers would no doubt be familiar with that. So these are related. Abuses of administrative monopoly are related to state-owned enterprises because of the close connection between state-owned enterprises and the local government. Local governments want to protect local SOEs. So what do? They give them easy credit. They also use administrative measures to protect their enterprises to block out foreign competition. And why are local governments so keen to protect local enterprises? And there are two reasons. One, as I mentioned earlier, local governments, under the current Chinese fiscal system, local governments oftentimes are not allocated sufficient funds to carry out their functions. They are tasked to provide a lot of welfare payments, but they don't have enough money for it. So they make the money from their enterprises. Two, promotion within the Chinese party state is based on performance. Local government officials are promoted if they are shown to have administered their local economies well. And how is that measured? Percentage increase in GDP. That is the most important number for local government officials in China. If you're shown to have increased the local GDP substantially, you get recognition within the party state, you get promoted quickly to the next level. And so Chinese local government officials are obsessed with boosting local GDP. And how do they achieve that? They help their local enterprises. And so what has resulted is what is known as regional protectionism in China. You have local governments and provincial governments doing everything they can to protect local enterprises. And that is part of the problem with state-owned enterprises that cannot be dealt with just by focusing on the state-owned enterprises alone. Because as I said, the issue of state-owned enterprises goes much further beyond just ensuring a level playing field between SOEs and private enterprises. So, yes, I promised to talk about some cases as an illustration of the kind of problems involving competition problems involving SOEs that we see in China. I mentioned this very important and groundbreaking investigation against state-owned enterprises that was announced last year, and it is the China Telecom, China Unicom investigation. Why was this investigation so groundbreaking? For a long time, some commentators have argued that state-owned enterprises are just outright exempted from the anti-monopoly law. Section 7 of the anti-monopoly law addresses state-owned enterprises, and it was worded very ambiguously, so it's not entirely clear if it was meant as an exemption of state-owned enterprises or just some exhortative declarations about the role of state-owned enterprises in competition. But the investigation against China Telecom and China Unicom confirmed unequivocally that state-owned enterprises are subject to the anti-monopoly law. The significance of this investigation is that these are centrally controlled SOEs. These two are two of the largest SOEs in China. They are controlled by the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, which is one of the most powerful ministries in China, which is also responsible for running the Great Firewall. For those of you who know about the internet censorship in China, MMIT is extremely powerful. It's involved in censorship of the press, of the internet, running the Great Firewall. And so it also is in charge of the 3 telecom operators. It's a very powerful ministry. For a long time, it was just assumed that the telecom operators were beyond the reach of the antitrust regulators. But last year, in November, NDRC, the competition regulator in charge of enforcing against price-related anti-competitive conduct, held a press conference, a very high-profile press conference that was televised nationally, saying that the two telecom operators have been guilty of anti-competitive conduct, margin squeeze, price discrimination, and excessive pricing. And the NDRC will investigate against them. And if they are found to have infringed the anti-monopoly law, the NDRC threatens to impose a fine of up to 10% of the annual turnover, which is not that shocking from an EU perspective, I guess. But up till this investigation, the largest fine we have seen imposed against Chinese enterprises has been to the tunes of 100,000 US. And 10% of the annual turnover of these two SOEs in 2010 was in the tunes of 40 billion US dollars. And it was seen as very surprising for a Chinese regulator to come out and threaten to fine two major national and state-owned enterprises. And what is even more interesting is that it's historically assumed that all controversies and confrontations among Chinese ministries are settled behind closed doors in the State Council. The ministries talk to each other and try to reconcile their differences. And it was assumed that if the NDRC was unhappy with the performance of the telecom regulators, it would have just approached the MMIT to try to work something out. So it was doubly surprising for the NDRC to come out to the public and try to rally public support against the two telecom operators. And while this investigation is very encouraging because, as I said, it establishes that SOEs are not beyond the reach of the anti-monopoly law, it is also quite peculiar in some ways because while this is dressed as a competition law investigation, there is still quite a bit of central planning, administrative interference in this investigation. I said the conduct involved in this investigation was margin squeeze and price discrimination. But what motivated the investigation at the end was that the Chinese public has always been very unhappy with these two operators because the general perception is that internet services, broadband internet services in China is expensive and slow. And China has one of the slowest broadband services in East Asia, and I think in the relatively more developed economies. So what the NDRC really wanted the two telecoms operators to do is not really to deal with the margin squeeze and the price discrimination issues, but to cut prices and to improve broadband internet service capacity. And so to placate the NDRC, the two operators have pledged to cut prices of broadband internet services by 40% before 2015 and lay down more cables to improve internet service speed. So it was dressed as a competition law regulation, competition law investigation, but in the end, I think this actually looks more like administrative direction. So I'm going to skip these other cases because I think I've spoken for way too long already. But I'll just end with some concluding thoughts about the regulation of competition, the application of competition law regulation to state-owned enterprises in China. The first question we need to ask ourselves is, what can competition law really achieve? And I'm talking about competition law from a narrow perspective, antitrust law. what can antitrust law hope to achieve against the state-owned enterprises in China in the current political economic situation? And my sense is that it's quite limited, because as long as some of the deeper structural issues in China are not addressed, as long as the government does not seek to clarify the relationship between the party state and state-owned enterprises in China, as long as the government continues to see the party state at different levels continue to see state-owned enterprises as cash cows, as revenue-raising vehicles, it's very hard to apply competition law to these state-owned enterprises in a conventional way, because these state-owned enterprises are not really ordinary profit-maximizing enterprises. They are semi-pseudo-government vehicles. And obviously, longer term, we would all prefer the government to clarify the relationship between state-owned enterprises and the party state, probably maintain more arm's length transactions between them, run them like profit-maximizing shareholders, while compensate them adequately for public interest, public service obligations. But that does not seem likely to happen in the near future. Another more deeper structural issue that needs to be clarified and resolved is central-local fiscal relationships. So long as the central government continues to underfund local governments, they will always have the incentive to favor local enterprises, to adopt abuses of administrative monopoly, to subsidize state-owned enterprises because they need to fund their local operations. It's also been argued that the central government should place less emphasis on plain GDP growth as an indicator of performance of officials, and to adopt a more holistic evaluation criteria. But before that is done, local officials remain singularly focused on growing local GDP, and it becomes very difficult for the local officials to resist the temptation to favor local state-owned enterprises. And one last problem with regulating state-owned enterprises is the lack of an impartial arbiter of disputes between the state and private sector. Chinese courts, I think it's fair to say, are not independent. They are part of the official bureaucracy. They're part of the administration. And they're also part of the party state. And in a dispute between a state-owned enterprise or even the local government and a private enterprise, so say a private enterprise were to bring a suit against state-owned enterprise or local government, is highly unlikely that there will be a fair, impartial hearing. If the Chinese government, if Chinese courts are not, the independence of the Chinese courts is not strengthened, competition law regulation, the effectiveness of competition law regulation will remain very limited. I'll end my presentation here, and I welcome comments and questions. Thank you very much.
In Brazil, the oil sector is a monopoly of the state, but the state-owned enterprise responsible for the Brazilian oil policy, Petrobras, needs to act following the principles of Brazilian competition policy in at least two sectors. First, the fuel distribution market, the only branch of oil sector that is not monopolized by the state. And second, when Petrobras uses its purchasing power as one of the most powerful instruments of Brazilian industrial and innovation policies. We first notice a relevant interest at the market of oil and gas resources in Brazil by the time of the First World War. On one hand, abroad, we had supply difficulties and the price increase resulting thereof, especially in relation to coal, steel, and fuel. On the other hand, in Brazil, there was a fear that foreign nations or economic groups would try to take control of such resources. Indeed, the fuel supply market in Brazil was controlled by 5 subsidiaries of large foreign companies. The fuel was imported from American and English refineries located at the Gulf of Mexico and Aruba in the Dutch Caribbean. Elevated prices as well as tax advantages and foreign exchange rates, which highly benefited the foreign distribution companies, gave rise to many conflicts through the 30s. On the eve of the Second World War, the share of oil products in the imports composition was extremely elevated in Brazil. Fuel imports were not just a serious problem to the balance of trade, but lead to the national dependency to foreign basic supplies, which were essential to the industrialization process, transport, communications, and to the country's defense itself. In this context, the military authorities concentrated on the oil issue, emphasizing the strategic importance of controlling this resource, therefore drawing attention to the vulnerable position of Brazil resulting from its complete dependence of foreign fuel supply. Many federal government initiatives in the late 30s and 40s indicate a progressive action by the Brazilian state concerning the fuel supply market. In 1938, the national oil supply market was legally declared of public interest, including activities such as production, import, export, transport, distribution, trading. Besides for that, the government structured itself to operate in this economic sector with the organization of the National Oil Council in the same year. The crucial step, however, would be undertaken in 1953 with the oil state monopoly and foundation of Petrobras, established by law number 2004, promulgated on 3rd October of the same year by President Getúlio Vargas. In the next years, during the government of Presidents Kubitschek and Goulart, the role of Petrobras in the state monopoly system was expanded as a measure to enforce the monopoly itself. In 1963, Petrobras was granted as the only importer of oil and oil products. This was intended at first as a way of controlling the trade-off balance. More important in the long term, it should bring a larger diversification of fuel supply sources, as well as providing better negotiation conditions in prices and freights, increasing national exports to those countries which supplied Brazil with oil and oil products. The law from 1953 didn't provide the supply of oil products as a state monopoly. However, in 1962, Petrobras starts its own supply business, which was planned to be later part of the state monopoly activities. Unfortunately, the project of a state monopoly embracing the whole oil chain was abandoned after the military coup. In spite thereof, the Petrobras fuel distributor became the indisputable market leader of oil products supply in Brazil. Now we move to the period of the Constitution of 1988. The Constitution maintained the oil and gas state monopoly, although the distribution of oil products remained open to private companies. After the Constitution, the state action is no longer considered as an intervention, but as the simple fulfillment of constitutional duties, as expressed in the principles and guidelines of the Constitution. So, the state is constitutionally legitimated to direct and conduct the process of reproduction of capital. The state intervention in the economy means that the state decides, on one hand, the amount of resources destined for capital reproduction, and on the other hand, the amount which is designated to the social objectives brought by the emancipatory clauses of the Constitution. The state may as well withdraw one activity of the market if it acts as an obstacle to the achievement of the constitutional goals, establishing either a state monopoly or a public service regime, which in Brazil is inspired by the French tradition of service public. The natural monopoly aggravates the economic concentration, and the law acts to reduce the risk of abuse of market power. The legal monopoly, however, is created to defend the public interest, setting apart a certain activity exclusively to the state. The constitutional concept of monopoly is always a public one, never that of a private monopoly. The difference between a public and a private monopoly is, as a matter of fact, attached to economic goals of the exclusiveness itself, not to the legal regime. It is clear, then, that the state monopoly is not submitted to the antitrust law, contrary to private monopolies. Besides, the constitutional concept of monopoly means always a legal monopoly and not a natural one. The state monopoly can be defined as the complete control by the state of the means of production and or change of a particular economic activity stricto sensu. The state monopoly is a relevant tool of the collectivity in the modern interventionist state. It is in fact a technique, a procedure of state action, employed to accomplish a certain task under the canon of the public interest. German authors prefer in this case to employ the terminology administrative monopoly, Verwaltungsmonopol, which perfectly emphasizes the relation between the monopoly and a public goal. The rules that establish a state monopoly are of a public character, which does not prevent it from being managed by a private legal entity. The basis of the implementation and accomplishment of the monopoly lies on the necessary conduction of economic policies by the state. The state monopoly is a special form of public economy, set up from deliberations of economic policy in conformity with the principles of the economic constitution and the rules of the constitution which deal with the goals of the state. The state monopoly implies that the legitimacy to exercise a certain activity in the public interest is withdrawn from the domain of the free enterprise. The essential feature of the monopoly is the exclusion of all other competitors of a particular activity, which leads to a broad control over it. The state is entitled to transfer the execution of such activities to third parties, as provided by law. Usually, this performance is undertaken by legal entities, either public or private, attached to the public administration, government bodies, or public companies. This was the case of the original text of the Constitution of 1988, the article 177, first paragraph, didn't allow the federal government to grant any concession whatsoever involving the exploitation of oil and gas fields, except the participation of states and municipalities according to the Constitution. But the Ninth Amendment, approved on the 9th November 1995, allowed the federal government to choose the system of direct public activity or to hire public or private companies. The federal government then may still act directly in the oil sector by means of a public company under its controlling interest. It is important to emphasize that the Ninth Amendment abolished the state monopoly over the direct public activities in the oil industry, but the state monopoly over such activities remains. Until 1995, oil-related activities could only be performed by the state itself or by an entity directly controlled by it, in the case Petrobras. For that moment on, the federal government has been given the possibility to exploit these very same activities, which still are a state monopoly, by itself or by contracting other public or private companies. The present state monopoly regime for the oil industry entitles the federal government to contract with private entities, as well as to decide who may perform economic activities in this sector. In short, the federal government has not changed its position as legal monopolist of oil exploitation and refining, but now it may choose either to perform these activities by itself or by public companies, or to contract with private entities. The effects of the state monopoly of oil exploitation and refining are extended to oil products. The terms of authorization, regulation, and control of the sale and distribution of oil fuels, including but not limited to gas, ethanol, and renewable energy resources, are determined by federal law. As we have been seen before, the oil supply system was declared a public utility as early 1938, which included its production, import, export, transport, distribution, and trade of oil and its products, as well as oil refining, whatever its origin. In relation to the North American debate, the notion of public utility refers to a private activity which is object of a particular attention from the state authorities, which create rules in order to assure that such activity will also be performed in benefit to the collectivity. The private activities of special relevance and usefulness for the collectivity must be regulated by the state, although they do not become, in result thereof, public services. Such activities are profoundly regulated by the state, whom, in case of the absence of the private entrepreneur, must provide the service itself. The national fuel supply, which in 1938 was already considered a public utility, conserved the same nature after the enactment of Law Number 9847 in 1999. Due to its importance to the collectivity, all activities listed in the first article of this law are subject to prior authorization by the National Oil Agency. The following activities, among others, are included under the concept national fuel supply: production, import, export, refining, processing, treatment, transport, transfer, storage, distribution, sale, trading, evaluation, and certification of oil, gas, and its products. As an example, just to indicate how close the fuel supply is regulated by the state, the National Oil Agency defines to whom the distributor may sell its products, limited to monthly rates previously determined. The distributor is not allowed to act as a retailer, and the retailers are allowed to contract with only one distributor. In Brazil, fuel prices are ultimately determined by the public administration and not by the market itself. In the 30s, Gardner Means offered a classic and yet simple definition of administered price, opposing it to market-built prices. Quote, by an administrated price, I mean one which is set by administrated action and held constant for a period of time, end of quote. Since then, economists and their readers oppose two price concepts. On one side, administrated prices. On the other side, private prices. Private prices would be the result of a free enterprise system and of the individual action of economic agents who act in this market. At first, beginning in the 30s, the price of oil and its products, as defined by the law, had to be determined by the state according to other elements than just regular market fluctuations. The state would subsidize any costs necessary to equalize the difference between real and official prices. From the 90s on, the policy changed in order to liberalize fuel prices. The import of oil products was allowed. The equalization of prices to the consumer was abolished. Subsidies were severely restricted. A few measures in order to assure the supply of fuel in remote areas were maintained, but in general, the liberalization of the 90s was applied on a large scale. An important result of such policy was the entry of many new distributors in the fuel supply market. As an inconvenient outcome, fuel adulteration and tax evasion escalated. It is important to notice that many large foreign distributors eventually left the market, since they could not compete against a monopolist supplier, Petrobras, and a predatory mass of regional distributors. With the development of the National Oil Agency and the stabilization of the economy, the fuel supply market tends to overcome this phase and consolidate itself. Oil and oil products are considered as administered price by the Central Bank of Brazil and are included in the list of administered prices which compose the National Extended Consumer Price Index. Despite the rhetoric of the price liberalization, the state still conserves the tools able to control the oil industry. For example, in case of abusive practice, the government may temporarily establish maximum prices. The Brazilian state still controls the price formation of oil products by means of the action of public companies, such as Petrobras, as legal monopolist of most oil industry-related activities, as well as leader of the oil national market. It is not difficult for Petrobras to control prices, even taught indirectly. Just as an example, some figures. According to the National Oil Agency, in 2010, Petrobras was responsible for more than 98% of the oil refining in Brazil. Due to the market share of the omnipresent Petrobras, its institutional and economic position, the state, which detains the controlling interest, is able to determine price levels which influence the price of the other competitors. Administered prices are an exception to a competitive price fixing. In case of a price fixing completely determined by the state, factors such as economic scarcity or private choices do not play any role. Instead, political decisions are determinant, of course, based on the law and focusing at the fulfillment of the public interest. Administered prices show, additionally, that some economic sectors are prone to less competition or no competition at all, which demand a more active role of the state as a regulator or, in some cases, as a substitute to competition. The Constitution of 1988 expressly determines the free competition as a principle of the constitutional economic order. This principle is to be understood as a tool of the economic policies and not as an end itself. Competition policy as a public policy itself or as a means to a broader economic policy can be diversely identified in different periods and legal systems. Massimo Motta says, quote, "To define competition policy is not an easy task, A possible definition might be as follows: the set of policies and laws which ensure that competition in the marketplace is not restricted in a way that is detrimental to society, which is not restricted in a way as to reduce economic welfare, end of quote. For instance, the antitrust policy may focus on general economic welfare, consumer welfare, protection to small companies, economic integration, as in Europe, and macroeconomic stability. We could think of other social reasons as fighting inflation and unemployment, political reasons as reducing the market power of certain groups or agents, and strategical reasons as environmental, industrial, and foreign trade policies. Another aspect which must be considered as we discuss the competition policy as a means to implement a certain economic policy is the relation between innovation and competition, a theme extensively studied by Schumpeter. According to the author, the main trigger of the capitalist development is the innovation. The innovation is a form of competition which differs from price fixing, a non-price competition. Of course, the innovation, considered as market power, depends on its success, which can be verified only after innovation investments are undertaken. Schumpeter asserts that a monopolistic power encourages investment in research and development, since the recovery of such investments has a high level of certainty. In case of a market with several competitors, it is uncertain that the innovation investments will be ever recovered. So, monopolies or markets with only a few competitors offer better conditions to innovation investment, whose results can only be verified ex post and not ex ante. And competition policy, according to Hovenkamp, differs the innovation resulting from collaboration among competitors, which may be harmful to competition from the innovation internal to the company. Economists emphasize that product differentiation through innovation brings larger profits to companies, and this is exactly what we see in developed countries. Again, a static analysis of antitrust policies is not enough to verify how the innovation distinguishes competitors among them and affects competition in a target market. No wonder that investment in innovation, research, and development is a core element of contemporary industrial policy and does not clash with the antitrust policy, since the goals which both are pursuing and submitted to the constitutional economic order. In 2010, a recent law in Brazil concerning the national purchasing power determines that the state will endeavor its best efforts to implement preferential processes of purchase of national goods and the contracting of local services, contributing thus to the development of the national economy. In the oil industry, Petrobras plays a key role as a developer of industrial and innovation policies determined by the federal government. The common antitrust law standards cannot be successfully applied to examine the singularity of a giant company, which is favored by the legal oil state monopoly and is the recipient of, and likewise responsible for, the largest innovation efforts in the late history of Brazil. Thank you.
The topic for my talk may sound kind of unusual to most in the audience. and especially since it is listed under the topic of state-owned enterprises, even myself, I have some problems, mostly because I don't actually know whether I will be talking about state-owned enterprises or not. Just to ask you a question, have you ever thought about the question whether the Supreme Court of Brazil is a state-owned enterprise? Very strange question. But it is a question which matters enormously for competition, as I think, and it will be demonstrated by the current discussion we have in Europe. It is a topic, at least, for competition policy. It might also be a topic for competition law. Before I start, I have to mention that I'm a member of a European thematic network, which is called Legal Aspects on Public Sector Information. And this group has drafted some recommendations for the development of the European law. And I have to stress, whatever kind of nonsense I'm going to tell you, this is only attributed to me and not to the LAPSI group. To start with, I would like to present to you a case from European competition experience, which is probably amongst the most debated and discussed cases of the European, before the European Court of Justice, the very famous McGill case. And actually, it's a very nice case for an introduction to my topic. What has happened in McGill? McGill is a competition case arising from the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. The case started in the 1980s, in the old times of broadcasting. And at those times, there were only 3 TV channels available on the island of Ireland, namely the public TV broadcaster, RTE from the Republic of Ireland, BBC, the UK public broadcaster, and ITP, a private TV channel. According to Irish and British copyright law, it was considered that the TV listings, the listings of the programs, the mere listings of the TV programs, enjoyed copyright protection. And this enabled those 3 TV channels to monopolize the downstream market for printed TV guides. McGill was an independent publisher, and McGill asked the TV stations to grant a copyright license for the TV listings, for the program listings, and the 3 broadcasters simply said, no, we want to monopolize this market for us, we don't want to have competition. And of course, in addition, the product offered by McGill was certainly more competitive, because what he wanted to do was to offer a comprehensive TV guide that would include all programs of the 3 TV stations, whereas at that time the 3 TV stations would only print and offer on the market programs, printed programs for their individual TV stations. So that was not really a very nice situation for the audience, but it was an additional source of income for the TV stations. This case is enormously important for the development of European competition law regarding the rules applicable to refusal to license a copyright or any other intellectual property right. It was the first time that the court ever said, yes, a refusal to license an intellectual property right can be considered an abuse of market dominance. The case has attracted, the decision has attracted a lot of discussion also among copyright lawyers who claimed that this is a copyright case. The UK courts and the Irish courts should never have accorded copyright protection to the mere TV listings, and so on and so on. But no debate whatsoever related to the fact that 2 public TV stations were involved. And this is actually the field where my topic comes into play. The problem also about the case is that the solution of the case took ages. It started in the 1980s. McGill went to the European Court in the 80s, and it took practically 10 years until the final decision was handed down by the European Court of Justice. Given the fact that there were 2 public TV stations involved raises maybe another idea on how we could promote competition much better. Why shouldn't the state tell its TV stations, you are under an obligation under public law to provide that information? Not as a matter of competition law, but as a public policy that enables private businesses to have access to public sector information. This is public sector information produced by a public TV station. And by this, we can actually promote private businesses, just like the business of McGill, who wanted to offer a comprehensive TV guide. And if you don't respect that obligation, the person can go to court, to an administrative court, sue directly, and probably get relief much quicker than under competition law. So what you can see here, that we might think about a different remedy, a public law remedy, applicable to certain public sector bodies. Another term which will prove to be very important in my presentation, that actually enhances competition. Yeah? So that's the starting point of what I would like to tell you. And here, that's a little bit, this digs a little bit deeper in the competition law problems of the McGill case. What we can see here is that the court actually distinguished between two different markets: an upstream market for information, namely the information on the TV programs, as the different broadcasting companies would intend to send out their programs. And we can see that copyright played a particular role in controlling access to that information. That's the copyright aspect. And there is a downstream market for printed TV guides. And by having a market-dominant position on the upstream market for information, the three TV stations were able to exclude competition on the downstream market. So what the court and also the European Commission applied in this case is basically a very standard, I would say a standard competition law analysis, a leveraging theory to this. So that's my starting point. What will I tell you about this topic and the current discussion we have in Europe? In 2003, the European legislature adopted the so-called Public Sector Information Directive, the so-called PSI Directive, which actually pursues this policy to enhance value-added information services, especially in a digital environment, by creating a new legal regime that actually would provide specific principles for enhancing access to such publicly held information. In December 2011, of course, the Commission came up with a directive for amending this directive of 2003. And of course, the question really is, what is the effect of this directive of 2003? And also, do we have to rethink the directive, since certainly the development of digital information and markets has further proceeded, and maybe the situation in 2012 is different from the situation in 2003. And this debate also has led to this creation of the LAPSI group, of which I am a member. What I will then do is I will try to analyze this directive from a competition law perspective, and then I would like to focus on a particular aspect which is especially important for this panel, because this panel is on state-owned enterprises, and the question is, to which extent do the two fields actually intersect, PSI law and competition law? Competition law only applies to undertakings, and the question then is, are courts undertakings in the sense of competition law? We are certainly convinced, and that was not a problem for the European Court of Justice, that public TV stations are undertakings. That was not an issue. It was not even discussed by the ECJ. But the concept of public sector bodies, which is the term used by the PSI directive, is maybe much broader. And the question is even, whether it is completely different, and maybe there is no intersection at all. So there are many issues that arise in this context. Another question is whether it really matters, to which extent it really matters. This is another question, but I think from a policy perspective, it is extremely important for us as competition lawyers to actually grasp the competition policy problems we have in this particular field. And it also shows that the traditional way we think about state-owned enterprises maybe is a little bit outdated, at least in an information society where the state is not only the owner of natural resources like petrol, like here in Brazil, which was the topic of the previous speaker. When it comes to information, governments nowadays hold large portfolios of information, and this has economic value, but quite often this information arises from core activities of the state, just like jurisprudence, case law, and so on, which is just one example, but it could also relate to the work of land registries and so on. So let's have a closer look at the PSI directive of 2003. Of course, the first question here is, what is PSI? What is public sector information? The definition is extremely broad. Basically, it can be anything. The definition is, or public sector information is defined as any content, whatever its medium. It can be written on paper or stored in electronic form, or as a sound. It can be visual or audio-visual recording, whatever. So you can see that format obviously matters, and you can already sense that the digitalization comes into play here, even with regard to the medium. But when it comes to content, what kind of content, it's extremely open. It's not narrowed by any consideration. It can be any information held by public sector bodies. Actually, the term public sector bodies is extremely important. So the directive only applies to public sector bodies, and we will have a closer look later on. We will have a closer look on what a public sector body is, and this maybe narrows the scope of application quite a bit. Examples are, again, judgments. Courts in the past have often decided on who will be the publisher of the official records. This is a decision made by the courts on competition. Do we have a level playing field of publishers, private publishers, when it comes to access to the court proceedings? Everybody wants to be the first one. And probably in the past, many national courts have decided quite freely on who will be the official publisher. And obviously, competition plays a role. Others might complain about such a decision. Yeah? So it has an impact on competition. And this is why I'm telling you, think about what courts are doing in this field. Geographical data and meteorological data are probably the two fields which are most discussed and where it is most important. But there are other areas, especially in the cultural field, which we should also take into account. Let's get back to the TV stations. Of course, things have changed quite dramatically. Public TV stations have large archives on TV productions. If they have to open up their archives, then their competitors, the private TV stations, would have access to it. And whether we make such a decision is an extremely, economically, an extremely important decision we have to make. Yeah? So the McGill case is probably a first case relating to TV stations and broadcasters, but applying the PSI law to this sector might nowadays have a completely different connotation. It's access to the large archives of the public broadcasters. And of course, there are the museums, there are the libraries, there are the universities. Think about results of research at universities, public universities. This it all is covered by public sector information because it's not narrowed down by any consideration. It's extremely broad. And this also explains the economic impact of the public sector directive. What were the objectives of the public sector directive in 2003? In 2003, the major complaint by private businesses was, we don't get access. think about land registries, and you have a publisher who wants to publish a new map. And he shows up at the land registry and has to deal with a public servant who says, it's not my job to promote private interests of companies. I'm here to fulfill a public task. That's my job, and don't bother me. I have better things to do. That was the starting point of the PSI directive, and also the complaints that actually convinced the legislator to draft or to come up with a particular regime. And the purpose of all this was actually to promote a new industry, mostly in the digital environment, for value-added information services. Think about nowadays, of course, Google and so on. I will come back to Google in a few minutes. However, the legal regime was relatively big. You would expect that the directive includes an obligation of the member states to create an obligation of all public sector bodies to allow the reuse, the commercial reuse of such information. This was not part, and is not part of the directive of 2003. It leaves it to the member states to decide for which kind of information will be open for reuse. So the definition is very broad, but whether there's an obligation to allow reuse, this is still for the member states. But if the member states decide, yes, certain information will be free for reuse, and my own public sector bodies have to allow reuse, then a particular regime applies to the reuse, especially when it comes to the conditions for reuse, whether a principle of non-discrimination should be applied on all this. So that's basically the starting point. And there are a number of exceptions. Unfortunately, TV stations are exempted. So McGill would still have the same problem. McGill would still have the same problem, unfortunately, I would say. But you can imagine for what kind of reasons the public TV stations in Europe are pretty strong. They didn't want the European legislature to make it applicable to their own activity. What are the principles? There's a very important principle of non-discrimination. When reuse is allowed, public sector bodies are not allowed to discriminate between similar categories of reuse. So competitors have equal access to such reuse. So discrimination is not allowed. You are not allowed as a court, and courts are covered actually, to grant privileges to certain publishers. That's no longer possible. In addition, which is very close to the McGill case, the directive is very much aware that we have that kind of vertical integration, that some public sector bodies develop their own business on downstream information markets or for value-added information markets. And in this regard, Article 10, paragraph 2 provides a principle also of non-discrimination, which would actually oblige the public sector body to apply the same conditions to private and independent undertakings that are applied to its own business, which is certainly very difficult to manage. Basically what they have to do is to separate economically into two departments, the generation of the information and then the downstream information service. Probably the most important part, and the one which is most discussed right now, is the charging regime. So the question is, how much do private businesses have to pay? Under the current directive, the rule is that public sector bodies are allowed to cover their costs, including the costs for the generation of the information. Yeah? It's not only for the costs that relate to allowing reuse, to basically copy the information, to providing the information in digital form, and so on. So the generation can also be taken into account, and public sector bodies are also allowed to charge for a reasonable return in investment. Another principle says that in principle there shouldn't be any exclusive licenses. So competitors should have equal access, no exclusive licenses, except where the issue is one of a service in the public interest. This is a term which arises from the European competition law. We have an exemption in Article 106, paragraph 2, on services in the public interest when it comes to the application of competition law. So the legislature also here had the same concept in mind. What is proposed now under by the Commission, December 2011, again, same era. The most important element certainly is that the Commission now proposes an obligation to allow reuse. The principle will be whenever information is free, whenever there is access to the information, maybe under different laws. There are laws in Europe that provide access of the public to the information, especially for journalists who want to write an article on a political scandal. So these are rules that deal with open government and so on, democratic principles, more transparency regarding government. Then the public has access, and then the directive says if there is access, then all member states also have to allow commercial reuse. So we now would have a European obligation to allow reuse. It's no longer for the member states whether they actually allow reuse or not. Yeah? So the discretion is taken away from the member states. That was really something that was claimed, especially by the business communities that are engaged in value-added information services. As I mentioned before, the most important topic now is the charging regime. And the directive here wants to implement, or the Commission wants to implement, a much stricter control. Charges should be limited only to the costs that relate to the reproduction and to the dissemination of the information. The generation, the costs that are involved with the generation of the information can no longer be entered for the price that will be charged for the information. The argument is that the generation of the information falls within the concept of public task. This is what the government produces anyhow, and therefore private businesses should not pay for such generation. That's the logic behind it. But it's also very clear that the directive or the Commission wants to make access much cheaper and reuse much cheaper, which additionally will enhance such businesses. Third point, which is quite important, the scope of application will be enlarged. Especially libraries will now be included in principle. Also university libraries, quite important. That's a big change for European universities. Museums and archives. And only certain cultural institutions like operas and so on and theaters are still excluded with regard to their archives. But libraries are a big topic. But as you can see, McGill, no, the TV stations still benefit from an exemption. My analysis. If you look at the proposal, now it's correct, Commission 2011, if you look at the reasoning for the proposal, you find this statement: the PSI directive prevents distortions of competition and establishes a level playing field for value-added information service providers. Good, we are all happy. Yes or no? Well, the directive is very much designed from the perspective or based on the assumption that the public sector body is the only source of that information and that this information is not substitutable. This was probably more true in 2003. It may be less true in 2012. Think about geographical data. There is now Google. And Google goes around European cities, also Brazilian cities, producing geographical data for Google Maps with a camera on top of a car and puts it on the internet. This is all geographical data. So the question is, maybe we already have some competition on the upstream market for the generation of information. This has so far not entered the considerations of the Commission. So in this regard, maybe we are running behind the technological development. Maybe in the discussion round I have more inside information. I once asked a representative of Google on whether they actually already compete with maybe land registries in the generation of content. That's a very interesting question and should be taken into account. What I would like to point out is that things are changing in this regard. And if we impose a price regime which is too strict, this might create an adverse effect on new businesses on the upstream market, because for them it's more difficult to compete with state bodies. So this might have an adverse effect. Then, in general, the price standard. That's maybe the part which I dislike most. Why? It's quite clear that, or it's very clear even, that you can't draw a clear line between public sector information and value-added information services. It's all about information. And the aspect of adding value is a process of refinement. And the question is, who is the most cost-efficient refiner of that information? So the question is, who should do the digitalization? Is it better that the state does it, or is it better that a private entity does it? Who makes the decision? And what the Commission is trying to do here is to make a legal decision, a normative decision on who should do what. My response to it is, well, it's about efficiency, and the state as such is not very well placed to make judgments on efficiency. Leave it to the market. But if you have to leave it to the market, then the price regime has to be very flexible, because the price actually defines, or we use the price system in identifying who is the most efficient provider of certain services. And it could be the state. So allow the state a little bit more flexibility. So that's a very important point. Third point, briefly, according to European competition law, it's not at all settled that exclusive licenses are bad. In the field of transfer of technology licenses, we have very old decisions, my seat case, where the court said, well, it's good to have exclusive licenses. If you want to create additional incentives for the investment in the downstream market, then you should have exclusive licenses. So within LAPSI, we have broadly discussed whether we should allow more exclusive licenses and maybe implement a system of auctions in order to have a level playing field for access to exclusive licenses. And of course, McGill, there should be a much deeper debate on which exemptions for certain areas should be allowed or not. So that's basically the whole discussion of PSI in a nutshell. We discussed it over a year in many, many meetings. But now I would like to come to the core question for this panel. What about the concept of undertakings? Do we actually have an interface here between competition law and public sector bodies? Under European competition law, the rules of European competition law only applies to undertakings. Undertakings are defined as economic activity. So the question is, do we have economic activity here? The fundamental decision in this regard is the Höfner decision, which presents us a very broad concept of economic activity. You don't need profit making. If the state decides, well, we provide a certain service for free, everybody gets it, it might still be considered economic activity if private businesses could do the same things. So if you get TV, public TV for free, it's still economic activity, because there could be private TV channels. Yeah? So that's the starting point, so it's a very broad concept. The term undertaking is not used by the PSI directive, especially by the different articles. It's once used in the preamble, and I will come back to this. The core concept is public sector body. What is a public sector body? The directive defines a public sector body as a body which is established for a specific purpose of meeting the needs in the general interest, not having an industrial or commercial purpose. So one might think, well, not having an industrial commercial purpose takes it all out from the concept of an undertaking, but you can see that this relates to general interest. And public sector body is defined with regard to the reasons for the establishment, not necessarily with regard to what the public sector body is doing. And especially if the public sector body decides to start its own information service in a downstream market, then probably it's pretty far away from the general interest, but it has still been established for the general interest. So you can establish a public broadcaster in the general interest for cultural reasons, and still you have BBC trying to monopolize the downstream market for TV guides. So it's pretty complex. Another consideration or another term which shows up in this context is that the directive only applies to information that is produced by a public sector body within the public task. The reason for this is that if the information is produced outside the public sector, outside the public task, then we are actually clearly in the field of a state-owned enterprise. So if you have, for example, this is where the discussion takes place. Would you consider a railway company owned by the state a public sector body? The question is the running of a public railway company within the public task or not? It certainly produces information on the customers, basically, yeah. But is it public task or not? The answer is, well, it depends on the perception of the state, of the member state. There's no definition of what a public task is. So everything is very flawed, and it's not quite clear. So the question is, do those concepts actually take this out of the realm of competition law? And there is one recital, recital 10, which seems to go in this direction. It says public undertakings are not covered by that definition for public sector information. When I first started to work on public sector information, I said, that's complete nonsense. And I said it. And now the Commission says, yes, you're right. And we stick to this nonsense. So this statement will not be deleted from the directive. Maybe in the discussion I can explain why. It has very formalistic reasons. It's in there. But what I have heard from a member of the Commission, or not the Commission, but a staff member who is responsible for BSI, he said to me, yes, you are absolutely right, it's a false statement, but not more. We have to look at the provisions, and it's clear it applies to public undertakings. Often we have public undertakings. Why is this the case? I already explained it a bit. General interest does not conflict with the concept of undertakings. It's overlapping. The kind of activity could be economic activity, especially like in the TV example. And the same also holds true with regard to public task. We have some examples, like the production of court judgments. This is certainly not economic activity, but we have other types of activity, like the generation of information by a TV station, which is certainly economic activity. So the generation might fall under the concept of undertaking, but in other cases it doesn't. And from the generation, we have to distinguish the making available of information for reuse. And to my opinion, this is clearly economic activity, because reuse is allowed as an input for other economic activity. Public sector bodies become suppliers of economic assets. They deliver services. And it's very hard to argue that this is not economic activity in the meaning of undertaking. And if now the directive would oblige the member states to allow reuse, this makes all those bodies an undertaking. It broadens the application of competition law. Because then they are under a public obligation, and then they have to do it, and they do it, and then they become undertakings. So it broadens the scope of application of competition. So it's quite an interesting development that takes place here. And now I would like, at the very end, I would like to look even beyond the current debate. I would like to raise the question whether we are very close to a paradigm shift. And in Leipzig, we somehow sense that something is going on here and something is changing quite dramatically. And this relates to government policies that have developed a lot in the member states. So that period of time where a land registry said, don't bother me, I don't want to provide information, that has nothing to do with what I'm supposed to do, has clearly faded away. And we can see it best in an area where the PSI directive does not apply, namely in the cultural field. For example, I just bring one example, a very nice example, Europeana. It's a European initiative on creating a platform that enables free access to all cultural content that is no longer copyrighted. It's the platform, the digital platform for cultural heritage in Europe. And the policy here is promoted by the European Commission, by the same Directorate General of the Commission, namely Information Society, to make information, public sector information available for free. So no charging at all. Everybody should have access, especially consumers, private people, citizens should have access for free. And the question is, I simply ask the question, is this kind of, from a competition law perspective, this kind of an extreme case of predatory pricing? Does this basically destroy all business models of value-added services that might do the same thing and they can't do any, can't make any money anymore because now the state is doing it itself? What you can see here is a continuous enlargement of the concept of public task. States nowadays consider it a public task to allow full access to information, to public sector information for free to all of its citizens. So things have changed quite dramatically. I have my own opinion, but I would not want to express it here myself. Maybe that's for discussion, whether from a competition perspective and also from an economic perspective, this is a wise development. It's certainly wise from a cultural policy perspective or a democratic perspective to have a more transparent government and to allow full access for free. But the economic consideration maybe is different. Conclusion. What we can see here is that, especially in light of the McGill case, that PSI rules can promote competition, especially in cases of vertical integration. Public sector bodies are also develop business activity on a downstream information market. Yeah? And it's quite a shame that we have those exceptions for certain sectors, because in those sectors also such cases can arise. What we can also see is that there is a tension. The objective of the directive is pretty much one of an industrial policy. We want to promote an information sector, new information services, and this the Commission tries to harmonize this with competition law principles, but quite often the incentives to promote this new business sector is stronger than the competition analysis and the competition arguments, and this is most obviously when it comes to the charging policy. So granting access, making it cheaper for businesses somehow is an overwhelming objective and puts competition law considerations and economic considerations a little bit aside. What we can also see, and that was the point I wanted to make in particular in the framework of this panel, is that the directive has not managed to create a consistent terminology and a clearly convincing concept of who is acting and to which extent this is actually economic activity. This is clearly missing, but I also admit it's terribly complex, and it somehow always makes me think about what are we actually talking about when we talk about state-owned enterprises. So are courts state-owned enterprises? Maybe yes, especially when they grant reuse. And you can also see that everything is in flux, and maybe we have this paradigm shift, and in 10 years we will have a completely different discussion. Thank you very much.
And I'd like to speak a few minutes about a specific aspect of the competition that state-owned enterprises, mainly the post office in Brazil. We could mention some important questions here about this theme. First, when do state-owned enterprises perform their activities at the same footing as the private corporation? considering tax and labor law, for example? When? Second, on the other hand, in which situations are public and private corporations subject to different legal regimes, tax immunities, privileged or monopolized activity? In Brazil, we have these two situations. Petrobras, for example, is the first one. But the postal office enterprise, the public owned state enterprise here is the second. Moving on the subject, we should also think about the following questions. Third, when a state-owned enterprise is subject to a system of privileges, especially regarding taxation and exclusivity of the business, will these privileges still be applicable in the case the company explore other types of services, parallel services? Fourth, in case these other services are non-exclusive, I mean they can be performed by the private sector and are used to raise funds to finance the company's main activity, cross-subsidies. Will these privileges violate free competition? Fifth, could these same tax privileges violate the power to tax and reduce budgetary resource of states and municipalities, in the case of a federation republic like ours? My colleague at the University of São Paulo, Professor Dr. Bercovici, has just given a lecture about a state-owned enterprise that pays tax and that operates in an economic domain that could be open to the private sector, but it isn't, by the Constitution, by our economic order. I just would like to mention, as another distinct example of the Brazilian debate, our state-owned enterprise in charge of the post service, whose situation is different and has been subject of many questions within our constitutional court. I'd like to say 2 points, important points, aspects here. First point, the doctrine and the precedents of our constitutional court accept the definition that the postal service is a public utility or public service, as my colleague said, in a French style, a service public that has influenced us. In opposition to economic activity stricto sensu, I mean the one that is typical to the private sector. Second point, the Constitution defines that the Federal Union has the exclusive power to regulate the postal service. These 2 points ensure, according to the Brazilian Constitution, the right the Brazilian Post Office Company has not to pay taxes on its assets, income, and services. Moreover, it ensures that the exclusivity of the business, in economic terms, monopoly, but legally speaking, public utilities or public services exclusively performed by the state. Even with these definitions, 3 issues are being discussed within our constitutional court nowadays, and I would like just to mention it. First, since this is a state-owned enterprise which renders public utilities exclusively performed by the state and is not subject to payment of taxes to the other entities of the federation, what should be tax regime applied when this owned state enterprise performs parallel service, such as small customs, financial, bank services? Could municipalities require the municipal tax on services, on these services? Could the state charge the tax of vehicles, the cars of the enterprise in the same cases? How to calculate it? Second, could these parallel activities represent violations to the free competition, given that other private companies providing such services are regularly called to pay taxes? What is the limit to this economic exploitation? Third, what is the limit to definition of postal service? Several courier companies intend to develop similar services in Brazil, but have been constantly denied to. In addition, several public companies in charge of public utilities intend to deliver their own bills, electricity and water, for example, and are in litigation with the state-owned enterprise, Correios, it's his name, so that they avoid having to hire them. Please notice that even with a great amount of definitions and settings by the Supreme Court, even though not unanimously, such as exclusive right and the tax immunity on the state-owned assets, these points briefly mentioned have not been overcome yet. These were my comments on the topic of state-owned enterprise and competition, which goes from the competition to the tax law, in addition to regulatory of public service concession. It's just comments about another aspect of state-owned enterprise in Brazil, distinct by the Petrobras, but in another sense like public service. Thank you for the invitation. My congratulations once more by my colleagues, professors at this table. Thank you.
Maybe you have realized that the subject of this discussion, the discussions of this morning, are very much related to the facts that we discussed yesterday evening in the opening ceremony. The publicly owned enterprises is a subject that is a key factor to the understanding, to the comprehension of the Brazilian history in terms of economic development. As I mentioned yesterday, some of the largest Brazilian companies nowadays were originated from public investments. And I can quote here 2 or 3 without much effort. The iron ore mining company, Vale, is one of the biggest examples. Embratel, as a telecommunications incumbent, is also originally a publicly owned enterprise. The CSN steel company is also was also privatized during the 90s. So it's really important to try to understand what would be the role of a publicly owned enterprise in a given economy, and how competition rules should be applied to these companies. Of course, there won't be a one-size-fits-all kind of answer. Each economy will have its own, their own problems and needs and situations to deal with. And the role of the government and, of course, the publicly owned enterprises will vary according to these circumstances, to these specific circumstances of each jurisdiction. And even within a single country, a single economy, the discussion will allow different perspectives. For example, here in Brazil, we are now discussing the impacts of changes in the interest rates that were promoted by publicly owned banks. The discussion concerns whether it is a movement towards competition and the benefit of the consumer and the society, or whether it is an illegitimate intervention from the government in the financial sector, and what would result in an unbalanced environment. the antitrust or competition agency does not hold a monopoly to provide answers to these questions. It's rather the opposite. We have to understand that other public policies may be being carried out by other entities of the government, and we'll try and our aim is always to preserve competition to the extent that it is possible, meaning that we actually understand that competition is not an end in itself, it's rather a tool to enhance public development and economic efficiency and social distribution of income and social fairness in general, as I mentioned yesterday. So these are just some erratic thoughts about this issue that I will conclude with a very provocative remark, I think. The OECD has issued this week what seems to be the final version of a paper dealing exactly with this subject, publicly owned enterprise. And the general understanding or the general approach or the usual approach of competition specialists towards the subject is that competition between private entities and publicly owned enterprises should be balanced. That's what's behind the expression level the playing field. One food for thought here. It's okay. It's defendable and it's understandable that the government should not, when directly acting as an economic agent, shall refrain from using its powers as the government to achieve advantages against its competitors in a given market. It's almost intuitive to reach this kind of conclusion. But there's a condition that precedes this intuition. A condition is that this specific market should work in a competitive manner, meaning a premise to the understanding that the activities of the state in a given market as an economic agent should be balanced in such a way that the state wouldn't have advantages against its competitors because of being the state, makes sense only to the extent that the field of activity in which the state is intervening is working properly in terms of competition. Because if not, a kind of intervention in which a publicly owned enterprise will get access to this market and try to change the standards of the acts of the competition, will actually be not only legitimate in terms of public interest, but actually absolutely coherent with competition law and competition values. A practical example, and with this I will conclude these comments. The privatization of the telecommunications sector in Brazil was always involved in high controversy because of the fact that the regulatory model that was created was unable by itself to actually shift the situation of a public monopoly to a regime of private competition. Telecommunication sector in Brazil until a few years ago, were actually, if not monopolized, but almost monopolized by private entities. So the shift was from one public monopoly to 3 or 4, according to the regions, private dominant positions. And one particular issue that the situation raised was the question of access to the respective telecommunication nets. Each incumbent would hold the monopoly in this access and would have to grant it to any possible interested companies to the extent that the interconnection fee was paid. The problem is that the interconnection fee was regulated based on historical grounds rather than any cost-related measure. And as a result of this, the prices of interconnection and the interconnection fees were extremely high in Brazil. One possible solution that was never implemented but was considered was creating a publicly owned enterprise to actually manage a telecommunication net, and so that this company would be able to actually identify the actual costs of managing the nets and then properly charge for the interconnection fees. And these costs would become reference for regulation to interconnection to private-owned telecommunication nets. So this would be an example of a publicly owned enterprise acting as the state or implementing a public policy with a potential benefit to the society. This was not implemented. There were other solutions, and especially the development of technology changed the scenario with regard to telecommunications. But this demonstrates that level the playing field cannot be considered a mantra that and never challenged. This debate must always be contextualized in the environment of the country, the institutional framework, and the specific circumstances of the respective economies. Thank you.
Okay, to open to the audience, if they have questions.
Right now, a consultant on competition policy and law. I was quite impressed by President CADE, Mr. Chinaglia, your comment. We are all agreed, by and large, that we should have a competition-driven environment. There should be a level playing field between the private enterprises and public-owned enterprises. I think, by and large, people would agree to that approach, all right. But then, when the government wants to intervene in favor of a public enterprise, in public interest, which you correctly highlighted, I think this is a thing which has to be built into the competition law itself. I'll give an example. When Air India is a government enterprise, got into some trouble, and a private airlines got into similar kind of a trouble, government was in a position to intervene to tell the banks, well, go and help Air India. The reason is not that they wanted to favor the public enterprise, but the public airlines, that is Air India, was serving some backward areas which the private airlines would never fly because it's uneconomical for them. So when there is a very important component of an activity which is in public interest, then the government intervention is quite justified. One second example, you know the food distribution system, we call it public distribution system in India. It's really serving the very poor people, disabled people, marginalized people with food which they have to get at an affordable price. Now the public distribution system alone can do it. A private entity may not be able to subsidize to that extent. Now here government intervention is called for. That is why in Indian law, Mr. Chinaglia, I would just like to point out that there is a provision that certain sectors could be exempted from the application of competition law in public interest. I think that's a very important thing which we have to do. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Francisco Marcos from Spain, and I have a comment for Professor Drexl. I really enjoyed your presentation because initially I couldn't think that we could find the way into finding out what's a public task in somewhere in some area apparently completely unrelated to competition law, which is this public service information regulation. And I think I see a clear connection, and I think what you have made is really useful. But I have maybe one doubt and a comment. The doubt is I don't really see how does McGill fit into this picture, because well, this may be a controversial case or whatever, but I don't think this is a case about access to public service information as you frame it initially. I think this is an intellectual property case or a copyright case, and indeed, contrary to what you have, the view you have given, I don't think this case provides a full-fledged exemption to antitrust, because it sets some conditions on which people or rivals could have access to that information. And I would relate it to another case that you probably know very well, which is the Bronner case. So I don't know why, what McGill adds to the picture that you have described. The other thing which you might find useful, and probably you know already, is that a similar case on access to public information looked at from competition grounds is now being discussed in the European Court of Justice regarding, it's a preliminary ruling, I think, posed by a Danish court that had to do with access to the, I think it's commercial registry information in some region in Denmark. And so there was one of these firms that tries to provide business information services asked the Danish registry to have access to the information. The registry denied or rejected the access. And so it was sued in the court for abuse of dominant position. And I think the question before the European Court of Justice just asks, is the commercial registry an undertaking, or is it a public body? And I mean, initially when I looked at the the new or the brief note which was delivered by the court, hasn't been decided yet. I thought it was pretty stupid, but because looking at this from a Spanish perspective, it seems clearly that commercial registries play a public task, because there are some legal effects attached to the fact of depositing information there. But I found out later that somehow we could divide the two functions developed by the registry. One is the one having legal effect from the other one, and maybe doing that we could somehow apply partially competition law to some of the actions done by this public undertaking, which is something that in other areas have been done by the European Court of Justice. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Thomas Jäger from the Max Planck Institute in Munich. I have one comment for Thomas Cheng and one for Josef Drexl. If I understood you, Professor Cheng, correctly, you argued for subsidy control as one solution to address the problem of too close ties between the government and state-owned enterprises. Tomorrow, if you're still here, you will hear me arguing that I think subsidy control has a very narrow sphere of application in specific transnational settings or settings of transnational market integration. I think for your case it would not provide a solution. I think for that you need a more general rule which addresses equal treatment basically between private and state entities on a general scale to also encompass other problems like, I don't know, preferential contracting, exemptions from antitrust rules, labor rules, and so forth, which you will not catch in subsidy with pure subsidy perspective. And what I'm alluding to is basically what we have in Europe in Article 106.1 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, which is basically an equal treatment rule. Which brings me to Josef Drexl, who, if I may put this provocatively, argues against equal treatment in the area of public service information, if at least in some, to some extent, if you want to do away with the exception of public undertakings in the directive, or if you want to remove that exception. I agree with you that to exempt public undertakings as a whole, and here I think I'm very much on the same line as my previous intervener, that's not the right way forward. But the key to understanding the PSO directive, as I see it, is the definition of public task. I think you would have to discriminate, or you have to differentiate between information that was generated by using the own resources of the undertaking or public resources. If public resources are used, I think you're in the scope of application of the directive, no matter what kind of entity it is, whether it's a public undertaking or some genuine public body. If, on the other hand, the undertaking has used its own resources, and I think I'm not 100% sure, but I think the McGill case would be a case where the own resources of the undertaking were used to generate that information, I do not see why the undertaking should be obliged to distribute that information freely. Actually, if you demand that, you would put that undertaking at a disadvantage in the competitive process, and you would have to compensate that elsewhere, which leads me to the question then, what about state aid? Does that mean through the back door to compensate for that loss in the competitive process, would you allow for state aid? So those are my two comments, questions. Thanks.
Daniel Zimmer from Germany. I have one comment on Thomas Cheng. I was very impressed of your detailed picture that you drew of the Chinese development. And your main point, as I understood, was that the state is still very present. That precisely is for me the interesting point in the Chinese experience, because the immense success that the Chinese economy has had during the last 2 decades seems to contradict what we believed and told for decades before. For many Western thinkers, it was always obvious that a state-run economy cannot function well, and the descent or the end of the Eastern European economies during the second half of the 20th century seemed to be the proof for that. And now we are observing that a country which has, of course, capitalistic elements and which sets free some forces, but where still the state is very present and prevails, as you described it, is so successful that provokes the question, what about, or were we right with our old perception, or what is the precise explanation for this success? That would be my question. Thank you.
About his presentation, I thought I would let the audience ask all the questions. In the slide, you mentioned that the current proposed charging methodology would distort the market and affect the way the most efficient, cost-efficient provider of information or commercializer of information would be selected. How exactly does that work? Because I can see how the current methodology may discourage the public enterprise from collecting information, but I mean, if you can explain that point, I guess I'm trying to. Well, now I'll answer the questions. First, Professor Zimmer's question. It's a very broad one, and I'm not sure if I'm really in a position, as I'm not an economist, to answer why has the Chinese economy been so successful in the last 30 years. I think it's worth asking if the Chinese economy has been successful because of the state presence or in spite of the state presence. The most successful Chinese businesses, at least as far as export is concerned, and I think it's fair to say that at least at this point still, China is very much an export-led economy, are private companies located along the coast in Guangdong and in the Shanghai area. Most of these are not state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises tend to be found in more traditional, in the most dominant ones tend to be found in sectors that operate only nationally. The petrochemical companies, for example, the telecom operators, as far as I know, I don't think that the petro companies do have overseas presence. The telecom operators, for example, I don't think they have much overseas presence. The banks, I don't think they have a very strong overseas presence. They try to expand abroad. And I think the general perception is that these state-owned enterprises are still not very competitive internationally. I mean, in Hong Kong, we do see multinational banks and mainland state-owned banks operating in Hong Kong, and our common perception is to avoid the mainland state-owned banks, except for the height of the financial crisis, when it was generally regarded that the state-owned banks basically had an implicit state guarantee, and so there was some rush to deposit money with the Chinese state-owned banks. But otherwise, I think the Chinese state-owned enterprises, with a few exceptions, are still not terribly internationally competitive. So I'm not sure if I feel comfortable drawing the conclusion that the state-led development model has been largely responsible for the success of the Chinese economy. But of course, there are many, many reasons, and it's probably beyond the time I have to discuss. To answer the question about state aid, the way I understood the question, I think you're suggesting that state aid rules from European Union law are more or perhaps uniquely applicable to a transnational body. Is that? Right. Right. Well, first of all, I think the general broader answer to your question is I think even state aid rules, if they are introduced in China, may not be the cure for excessive state subsidy and assistance to private enterprises. And to be honest, at the end of the day, it's a political solution that is required, not a legal solution. I think a lot of you may be aware of the fact that enforcement of the law is not perfect in China. You can adopt more and more laws, and if they don't get enforced in an impartial manner and with an effective and independent judiciary, I don't think adopting state aid rules would change the picture very much. But as to the value of state aid rules in a country like China, unitary country in China, I'm not sure if I would be so quick to dismiss the relevance out of hand. It's an extreme political taboo to analogize China to a federalist system, but there is actually a lot of parallel between China and a federal state. In many ways, you can argue that there are de facto quite a lot of federalist features in the Chinese system, even though, I mean, I want to make no mistake about it, no one talks about China from a federal perspective, within China anyway. It's very much considered a political taboo. But so given the current political reality, I'm not sure if the state aid rules of some kind have no usefulness at all in the Chinese system. But I'll let Professor Drexl answer the questions.
And they are, to a certain extent, difficult ones. Let's start with the question on McGill. McGill was brought up by me for the mere purpose of demonstrating that competition law also already deals with such cases. And what is crystal clear is that the issue that these were public TV stations, or 2 of the 3 TV stations were public ones, did not play any role. So European competition law applies to undertakings, period. Whether they are private or public doesn't matter. What I wanted to hint at is that there are certain weaknesses of competition law enforcement. And it took, in this particular case, it took terribly long. And I heard some gossip that McGill actually went bankrupt by the time when the decision was handed down by the ECJ. So the question is, why shouldn't states deal differently with their own information and to promote access a bit more? And this is where PSI comes into play. And this is also in the mind of the European legislature, that there is large complementarity of the goals of PSI law, European PSI law, and competition law. And the purpose of my presentation was to dig a bit deeper. And also what we are doing in LAPSI is to actually evaluate whether it's completely true that the 2 fields are in a relationship of complementarity, and that's not necessarily so. And we tried to figure out whether the policy and how the Commission tries to develop its own policy goes in a good direction. So McGill was basically brought in as a case which most people here might know about, especially the Europeans, and which describes the kind of issues we have. And it's also very clear that there is this general assumption, more or less, on the side of the European legislature, that public sector information is kind of a, now I used the term which I usually don't use, an essential facility. Yeah. So that's more or less the perception that the European legislature has here, and McGill is very much cited as the European rule on the European essential facility doctrine. This is the case or not, that's a different debate. I'm very grateful for this indication that there is a case now pending before the European Court of Justice on access to commercial registration. That's actually another field of PSI which is extremely important in the practice of PSI rules. And there is, of course, the question, as I understand the case, which I'm not familiar with. I haven't heard about it, I have to admit. There is a difference. And it's actually it's also explains furthermore. It explains better what I wanted to communicate is that as long as there is no obligation to allow reuse, the refusal to allow access or to allow reuse is not evidence of economic activity. What commercial registries do is certainly a public function which may serve private interests, but it's a public function like what land registry do. It has meaning for transparency on private relationships, on private ownership, and so on. Commercial registries create transparency as to the status of companies, to the form of liability, and so on and so on. That's what we know. But so it has a private meaning, but it certainly is a public function. And the registry as such is not engaging in any economic activity as long as they are not commercializing that data. That is also very similar to what courts do as long as they don't grant access to the court decisions. It's fine, but usually they do, and that's also their purpose, then to make it publicly available. But once they give privileges to certain publishers, then I have a problem, and this is definitely a field for PSI. So it becomes problematic once they allow to reuse, and my argument was we now are heading in the direction of a European obligation to allow reuse, and this makes all public sector bodies an undertaking, because then they deliver assets for downstream markets or input for downstream markets. And the most difficult question relates to the further two remarks, also to the one by Thomas Cheng on charging and also financing. I didn't address the issue of financing. Public sector bodies are financed in very different ways. And there's also the question whether this matters. This was brought up by Thomas Jäger, as I understood him. He said maybe we have to distinguish according to different financing schemes. Just to bring two examples, and that makes it much clearer. Look at, again, judgments. And the judgment example also brings in another consideration. And there is, of course, an interaction between the charging regime and the output, the generation of information. If you take court decisions, the question whether a court is allowed to only charge for the costs of dissemination or reproduction of the data, or also for the production of the data, so how expensive is it to make a court judgment, to produce the judgment, should this enter the price for the data? Such a rule does not have any impact on output. Courts will not deliver fewer decisions only because we have a stricter regime on the charging policy when it comes to PSI reuse. Whereas if you have a museum which organizes an exposition on modern art, and this museum wants to print its own catalog and market it as well as possible in order to have additional income, which can then be used for organizing other expositions in the future. In such a situation, you have an immediate impact of the charging regime on the generation of information. And also, so there you have a direct correlation. It's even more complex. Go back to the judgment example. The question is here, who finances judgments? It's definitely a public task to have a court which decides, let's say, private disputes. But who pays for the judgments? PSI people usually say, we have a public task, it's the taxpayer who pays for it, so private business shouldn't pay for it. Wrong, even in the case of judgments, because it's the private parties who have to pay fees. Maybe they don't cover everything. And there you are, the private parties suddenly cross-subsidize the business of maybe publishers who then charge a price on attorneys, and the attorneys benefit if you introduce the now proposed charging regime by the Commission. So the parties basically cross-subsidize the attorneys, and the later parties then pay lower fees maybe to the attorneys, but still have to pay high fees for the court judgments, whatever. So it's terribly complex, and it seems that in each set of circumstances, you may come up with different considerations, but obviously the Commission right now is not thinking about the complexities of financing, and I think this is a partial answer to Thomas' considerations. So there's a lot of interaction going on between the financing of the generation of the data and the prices you're allowed to charge. And this also plays a role, and that was more your question, Thomas. How does this interplay on the question on who is the best, I would say, the commercializer for creating more or better access to information? One might think about allowing options. Why shouldn't public sector bodies say, well, you can have my raw data and I charge you a price X. I can also assemble data, make larger packages of data. You don't have to do it yourself. And then I have a third option. I even digitalize it in a more handy version. And I charge you different prices. And it's for you to decide what option do you prefer most, and then it's for the private entity to decide. Well, maybe I'm better in doing it, and I do it myself. I don't ask you to do the refinement of the information. So, my argument is maybe the market could solve that that issue better than by intervening and telling the public sector bodies, now you have to digitalize everything. It's not enough that you simply deliver raw data. That's more or less, that's what I didn't explain very well, but that's also a provision of the directive, and the Commission goes more in this directive of telling the public sector bodies invest in digitalization. So that's also an additional aspect of all this. So unfortunately, it's very, very complex, and I think we are not at the end of the discussion of how this field of law has to develop. Maybe just a last word, because Thomas brought it up very briefly. I should explain this. Thomas said, well, what about the exemption on public undertakings? Again, there is no exemption on public undertakings in the directive. The recital make that statement or seem to make that statement, but it's only in the recitals. And the recitals, and this is what I would like to explain furthermore, because it highlights that things are different in PSI. The recitals make the statement, the directive does not cover public undertakings in the context of defining the term public undertakings. And this particular recital starts by making a reference to the directives on government procurement. And the directives on government procurement use the term public sector bodies. So the directive basically says in this context, we use the same term, and in the public sector, in the public procurement directives, it does not cover public undertakings. But in the field of public procurement, the state is on the customer side. And according to European competition law, being a purchaser doesn't make you an undertaking. That's the Venin decision. Very much disputed, especially in Germany, but it's the Venin decision. A customer position, a purchaser position doesn't make you an undertaking. Whereas in the PSI situation, the state is the supplier, and the supplier usually is considered to be an undertaking. So by transferring the concept of public sector body from public procurement law to PSI law changes the statement, and the European legislator simply didn't understand it, period. That's maybe the best explanation why the directive is wrong. And the last word on this, why is the European Commission not able to change? The legal service doesn't want it to be changed for a very simple reason. They say if we amend the directive, we can only amend the recitals if the provision to which it refers will be amended too. But there will be no amendment to the term public sector body, hence they can't change the recital. That's a very formalistic logic, so they know that they made a mistake in drafting the recitals, and it will remain a mistake. Sorry.